Welcome. My name is Meena Srinivasan, and I am speaking to you from Richmond, California, the traditional homeland of the Ohone peoples. And mindfulness for me is really rooted in interdependence, so I'd like to start with invoking a sense of gratitude to my land ancestors, and I invite you to do the same. In Canada and New Zealand, meetings and sporting events often begin with a land acknowledgement. And if you don't know who the indigenous stewards are of the land that you are currently living on or the land that you call home, just note that. So let's just take a moment now and tune inwards and acknowledge the stewards, the original inhabitants of the land that we preside on. Thank you so much for being here. I'd like to express my gratitude to you. There are so many places and things you could be doing right now, yet you decided to join me in this virtual space. And those of us who are engaged in this work certainly aren't in it for money or fame. And I firmly believe that we've been called to contribute towards making the world a more compassionate and equitable place. I send my heart along to each and every one of you. Right now is a really good reminder of just how not in control we are. But these times of uncertainty are opportunities to really deepen our practice, because mindfulness isn't about getting comfortable, but really cultivating the capacity to hold our discomfort, our fear and suffering with love and compassion. I like to think of mindfulness as the ultimate embrace and holding whatever's arising with loving awareness. Now, how and where we direct our attention is what nourishes us. And oftentimes in the modern mindfulness space, particularly with how mindfulness is often brought into schools as an intervention, it can be equated with self-regulation. Now, being able to work skillfully with our nervous system is such an important capacity for humans to build. But I'd like to invite us to shift from viewing it as solely self-regulation to actually self-enhancement, which is something one of the teachers in my spiritual community, Larry Ward, talks about. And he talks about how we're actually enhancing our nervous system to engage with and ultimately embrace greater complexity. So with this framing around holding complexity, by the end of our time together, my hope is that you incorporate some strategies for caring for yourself so you can care for others, that you can deepen your understanding of mindfulness and social and emotional learning in service of belonging, and that you leave feeling hopeful. Right now, with the unfolding of COVID-19 on the global scene, hope is really important, and I'm going to talk a little bit about why that is. Now, in a webinar that is focused on mindfulness and social and emotional learning, it's important that we actually practice. So I'm going to invite you to take some time now to really cultivate the energy that is so needed in the world during times of crisis and uncertainty. So if you could just get in a comfortable position, and if it feels safe for you, you can gently close your eyes and just begin to tune inwards. My teacher, Thich Nhat Hanh, said that when the crowded Vietnamese refugee boats met with storms or pirates, if everyone panicked, all would be lost. But if even one person on the boat remained calm and centered, it was enough, and it showed the way for everyone to survive. Calm is contagious, and I'm going to offer a practice to help you find your rootedness and resource yourself while you also cultivate an open heart. So let's begin by bringing awareness to our breathing. And I invite you to touch that your own mother was breathing for you before you could breathe for yourself. just as her mother breathed for her. And when we're in the womb, we rely on our mother's breathing to receive oxygen to our developing organs. So just take a few conscious breaths in and out of your heart space. Breathing in and out of your heart space. And reminding ourselves that those who have come before us have gone through challenging times, much more challenging times than we're going through now. I think of my paternal grandmother, who was married off at the age of 13 and lived the majority of her life in pre-independent India. And I invite you to draw upon the resilience of your ancestors. They could be your blood ancestors, your spiritual ancestors, or your land ancestors, or anyone who represents resilience for you. And just ask for their presence to be with you now. Feel the presence of this being embracing you, holding you up, and know that their strength is in you. And as this being's presence embraces you, try and cultivate a sense of rootedness and groundedness, while also opening your heart. You may want to physically have your hands by your side as you expand your chest and root your feet into the earth. And trust that you have the capacity for rootedness and open-heartedness, and know that you can act from a place and space of groundedness and compassion. Now know that you can always draw upon the strength of those who've come before. They live on through us and are in us. Take a few more deep breaths as you simultaneously hold the sense of rootedness and openness of the heart. So much of my practice now is on cultivating this inner expansiveness. And I love this quote also by Thich Nhat Hanh, that if your cup is small, a little bit of salt will make the water salty. If your heart is small, then a little bit of pain can make you suffer. Your heart must be large. I invite us all to connect with this image of the spacious sky and try and touch that expansiveness, and to see how we can cultivate a sense of expansiveness within, so we can hold both the pain but also the possibility of this moment. You know, I don't have a crystal ball. I don't know what the future holds, but I do know that hope is on one end of the spectrum of how we meet this present moment and envision our future. And the other end is despair. And right now, having hope matters. And I'm not talking about hoping that our experience could be different. I mean, that's not mindfulness. But I am talking about active hope. And active hope is the idea that hope is something that we do rather than having. And this is really from the work of Joanna Macy. And Joanna Macy writes about the Great Turning, which is the name for the essential adventure of our time, the shift from the industrial growth society to a life-sustaining civilization. And this adventure will birth new strengths, a wider network, and an experience of deepening our aliveness with great meaning and purpose. So active hope means having a clear vision about what we're hoping for, and then deliberately playing our role to make that vision a reality. So let's just pause here for a second and hold this question of, what's my vision and what role am I here to play? So again, asking ourselves, what's our vision and what role are we here to play? You see, hope is a decision that we make every day. Now, in the modern mindfulness world, we often talk about acceptance, but passive acceptance of our current reality isn't mindfulness. When we change our inner determination, everything begins to move in a new direction. And the moment we have a powerful resolve, every nerve, every fiber in our being will orient itself towards that vision. So given the current state of the world and all this uncertainty, hope is really important. Because if we think this is never going to resolve itself, it's never going to work out, then every cell in our body will be deflated, will give up the fight, and that is what we transmit to others. And as folks who are working with young people and who are really trying to build a better world for both the present but also future generations, we have to transmit this hopeful energy and engage in this practice of active hope. Particularly during COVID-19, who do you want to be? And I love this slide here. And so let's just take a moment and reflect on it for a moment. Do we want to be in the fear zone, the learning zone, or the growth zone? My hope is that more and more people are in that growth zone. And through your work, more and more people are in that growth zone, because that's really what we need right now. You know, for me, I envision a more compassionate and just world. That's my vision. And I know in my heart that mindfulness and education and social and emotional learning centered in justice, I'll say that again, centered in justice, can be a vehicle for creating a more loving world for future generations. Now, this session, this offering, it's a humble offering. I don't claim to have all the answers, but I believe now more than ever, as we face fear and uncertainty, we need to create conditions for connectedness and our collective well-being, and mindfulness and SEL in service of belonging are how we do that. Now, in my career, I've seen firsthand how prioritizing SEL can be transformational for students, teachers, families, schools, and entire districts. And when I use the term SEL, it is inclusive of mindfulness and it's centered in equity. So a little bit about me, just so you know where I'm coming from. Some of you may not know me. This might be the first time you're engaging with me or my work. I taught middle and high school for over a decade, and I have taught and led in a variety of school settings, so public, private, urban, and international. And mindfulness and SEL were really fundamental to teaching, learning, and leading. And several years ago, well before mindfulness became a buzzword, I had the profound opportunity to study mindfulness with some of the world's best known teachers. And through growing my own personal practice, I brought a sense of peace and deep meaning into my life. And I was really cultivating this present moment awareness that better enabled me to understand my students, which resulted in stronger relationships and more effective teaching. I actually spent 5 years, ages 26 to 31 after graduate school, living in India, studying contemplative practices and sharing these practices with educators and young people throughout the region of South Asia. And I was very much connected with Thich Nhat Hanh's presence in that region through an organization called Ahimsa Trust. Now, my journey as a mindful educator and the resources and practices I engaged in and developed while in the classroom culminated in the publication of Teach, Breathe, Learn, Mindfulness in and Out of the Classroom. And Teach, Breathe, Learn was really one of the first education resources. It was from that first wave of mindfulness and education resources that were accessible to educators worldwide. Now, around the time of Teach, Breathe, Learn's publication, one of my mentors, Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning, CASTLE, co-founder Linda Lantieri, urged me to transition out of the classroom and join an innovative team in the Oakland Unified School District, working in partnership with CASTLE to implement SEL system-wide throughout the school district. Now, Oakland, along with 8 other large, complex urban school districts in the United States, were the original districts that were part of something called the Collaborating Districts Initiative, or the CDI, which was an effort to study and scale high-quality, evidence-based academic, social, and emotional learning. Now, the goal of this initiative was to help superintendents and school districts move beyond test scores and prioritize whole child education, while also creating resources and tools that could then be used to support large-scale SEL implementation in other districts. Now, being part of the CDI learning community was a tremendous opportunity to learn from and with other districts engaged in similar work. One of my focus areas on our SEL team was middle and high school, and what I quickly discovered through my conversations with my counterparts in other districts was a tremendous gap in SEL resources available for middle and high school teachers, particularly related to SEL integrated instruction, which is why I decided to write SEL Every Day, integrating social and emotional learning with instruction in secondary classrooms. Now, justice has always been central to how and why I engaged in mindfulness in SEL, and this is a photo of myself with some other next generation leaders at Castle's inaugural SEL Exchange, speaking about building a culture of equity through SEL. So what I'm offering to you today in this short webinar really reflects that unique background as someone who is not of the dominant culture, that carries a certain degree of expertise and depth of practice and published books in both mindfulness and SEL, and that practical experience of being on the front lines as a district leader engaged in systemic SEL implementation. I did that work for 5.5 years in Oakland. Now, one of the most powerful lessons I learned while I was in Oakland was that leadership is key. And without leadership that models SEL as it leads for SEL, then implementation is ultimately not as effective. Now, particularly, leaders have to embody that calm, compassionate centeredness with this unfolding of COVID-19. It's so critical that leaders really have that centered, calm sense and that compassionate sense as they're leading schools and school districts. Now, knowing this truth around how key leadership is, a little over a year ago in March of 2019, I transitioned into serving as the founding executive director of Transformative Educational Leadership, or TEL. And TEL is an innovative program that creates beloved community for leaders across all sectors of the educational world who want to create systemic transformation, but systemic transformation that's really based on a deep foundation of inner development. And TEL is centered on the integration of leadership, equity, SEL, and mindfulness in service of systems change. And if you're interested in learning more, do check out our website and you can download our logic model there. Now, over the years, mindfulness has become one of those popular, trendy terms, but what exactly does mindfulness mean? So when you hear the word mindfulness, let's just pause for a moment. What comes to mind? And how would you define mindfulness? So just tune in words, or if you have a pen and a piece of paper handy, just jot down what comes to mind. How would you define it? Now, I'd like to offer you my definition. And for me, very simply, and my definition has evolved over the years, it's paying attention to our inner and outer life as it unfolds while being grounded in our body, our breathing, and our senses so that our mind can settle and we can cultivate a curious, open-hearted presence and awareness of interbeing. So again, I define it as paying attention to our inner and outer life as it unfolds while being grounded in our body, breathing, and senses so that our mind can settle and we can cultivate a curious, open-hearted presence and awareness of interbeing. Now, for those of you who may not have heard of this term interbeing before, I'm sure many of you have, I'm going to tell a little story to communicate what's meant by interbeing. So I spent ages 26 to 31 living in my ancestral homeland of India. And when I was 28, my adopted city of New Delhi had become the site of numerous bomb blasts fueled by tensions between Hindus and Muslims. So I've experienced living in an extremely stressful, heightened situation before. And I have that sense of what can happen if we don't really take action and are actively trying to nourish our spirits. Now, in the course of 1 month, there were 5 deadly attacks. Our school was under lockdown. And during this time, I was really desperate for guidance on how to support my students. So after a long school day, I attended a talk by a visiting peace activist honoring the anniversary of Mahatma Gandhi's birth. The talk was held at the site of his martyrdom, and it lauded his commitment to nonviolent societal transformation. That evening changed my life. The speaker was Venerable Thich Nhat Hanh, a renowned Vietnamese global leader who I've mentioned earlier in this teaching, in this webinar, who had been nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Now, in a profound weaving of birth and death, Thich Nhat Hanh challenged us all that evening to be Gandhi's continuation, and he introduced a term that's foundational to creating a beloved community: interbeing. Interbeing means to interdependently coexist. Interbeing honors the interdependence of every person to all other persons and aspects of our planet. Everything is connected to everything else, and our beloved community extends to our relationship with this planet. Now, in a beautiful illustration of interbeing, Thich Nhat Hanh writes, "If you are a poet, you will see clearly that there is a cloud floating in this sheet of paper. Without a cloud, there would be no rain. Without the rain, the trees cannot grow. And without trees, we cannot make paper. The cloud is essential for the paper to exist. If the cloud is not here, the sheet of paper cannot be here either." He goes on to explain that if we look deeply enough, we can even see the logger who cut down the tree to make the paper and the logger's ancestors as well. Looking at the paper in this way, we can cultivate a discerning nature of the way we make paper. It's this shift from extraction or forgetfulness to what we can call an interbeing consciousness. Now, interbeing helps us see that in reality, we exist in a complex web inhabiting each other. The nonviolence Gandhi and MLK practiced is born from interbeing. Dr. King wrote, "In a real sense, all life is interrelated. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. This is the interrelated structure of reality." In the SEL world, we talk about needing to connect, but the ultimate truth is that we are already connected. We just don't often recognize this. But if we can shift our sense of self from a strongly individuated and separate identity to a connected, collective identity, we will view our world, our nation, and the work we do in schools with fresh eyes. This vision is what mindfulness and SEL in service of belonging is all about, and it requires a major paradigm shift. This shift means that we attune to the intelligence of interbeing. Interbeing helps us see that our reality is beyond mere interconnection. We exist in this complex web where we inhabit each other. And if anything, COVID-19 has really illustrated that. And it's a ripe opportunity to practice mindfulness with this interbeing foundation, because we can really see how our actions impact others and that nothing exists independently. So if we are truly practicing mindfulness, when interbeing is the foundation, we are not only attuned to our senses when we drink our tea and coffee and really tasting and savoring that tea or coffee, but we understand that the cloud is also part of our tea, and we reflect and touch the infinite causes and conditions that resulted in our coffee or tea being in our cup, from the soil to the sun to the workers on the coffee or tea plantations and their lives and their working conditions. Now, I want to name that first being able to truly taste your delicious tea or coffee instead of drinking your worries, which is often what we do and which many people are doing now. To truly taste what you're drinking is a radical act of self-compassion. Now, once you can care for yourself, then you are truly able to be there for others. Thich Nhat Hanh talks about how the greatest gift we can offer others is our full presence. And right now, before you begin tackling systemic issues, as they say, when we fly, you got to put your oxygen mask on first. Now, I have colleagues and friends who are like, I feel you on how mindfulness must be engaged, but I'm not in a good enough space to really think about that right now. I just need some strategies for self-care before I can show up for others. So with that in mind, I'm going to offer some strategies for how you can care for yourself. So the first thing is you got to resource yourself first. And one of the easiest ways you can do that is every day ask yourself, what's one essential thing I need to do that's vital for my well-being, and do that religiously. You have to make sure that's part of your routine. So whether it's meditating, whether it's eating right, whether it's exercising, you have to calendar it and build it into your schedule. Now, I also want to share, if you haven't seen this beautiful diagram, this offering from the Center for Contemplative Mind and Society, if you haven't seen the Tree of Contemplative Practices before, this is another great resource to help us see all these different ways we can actually cultivate awareness, connection, and communion. And so the roots of this tree really symbolize the two intentions that are foundational for all contemplative practices. So I invite you to explore that. Just sitting meditation isn't the only way that we can engage in contemplative practices, and there are many ways we can cultivate insight and open-heartedness right now. I also encourage you to take SMART breaks, and SMART stands for short moments of awareness repeated many times. I have a 2-year-old, so SMART breaks are really important for me. These micro practices of just coming back to myself, just every few minutes. It's really, really helpful. So I encourage you to engage in those SMART breaks. You can even set a timer on your phone where you just remind yourself every 20 minutes to just come back to yourself and breathe. Even if it's one breath, that is better than none, right? One breath is better than no conscious breaths. And then I invite you to touch joy. Whenever you experience a moment of joy throughout your day, soak it in and savor it. And this might also be an opportunity where you realize how much joy certain things bring that you do not currently have in your life in the same way. For example, my husband is a huge basketball fan, and the fact that the NBA is not in season right now is just crushing him. But he's realizing just how much joy basketball, in particular, the NBA, brings to him. So I know when the NBA is back and playing again, he is going to really soak it in and savor it. But soaking in things that bring us joy can be small. For me, it's my son's smile. It's snuggling with my son. It's drinking a really good cup of coffee. It's feeling the wind on my face when I ride my bike. Just take the time to savor and soak it in and be with it. Now, I also encourage you to practice the reframe. And one of the ways I often practice the reframe is shifting from saying, I have to I get to. Now, I know I'm speaking from my perspective as a parent that's trying to juggle work and also having a 2-year-old at home right now. And so I find it's really helpful for me, instead of I have to watch my son, I get to. I mean, Normally, he is in preschool for 8 hours a day, and it's just such a gift to have him home with us. I'm not saying it's easy all the time. I'm not saying that, there aren't days when I could really use a break, but just that simple shift mentally from I have to I get to has been profound. I also love this practicing the reframe from Danielle Laporte. So we are not social distancing. We are physical distancing. I'm sure you are on Zoom calls, you are calling people, so you are not socially distancing yourself. You are just physically distancing yourself. And we're not quarantining or locking down. We are retreating for wellness. How different does it land in your body when you say retreating for wellness versus quarantining or locking down? And we are not isolating. We are protecting our health. And we are not in fear. We are in choice. We are making a decision to do this for the highest good. So again, really important to practice the reframe. I also love just instead of thinking about what is the meaning of all of this, Brother Fapai, a monk in the Plum Village community, talks about this shift to asking oneself, how can I bring meaning to this moment versus what is the meaning of all of this or what is the meaning of life? How can I bring meaning to this moment? So again, shifting from I have to I get to. How can I bring meaning to this moment? And Danielle Laporte's wonderful reframe here, instead of social distancing, we're physical distancing. Instead of quarantining or locking down, we're retreating for wellness. And instead of isolating, we are protecting our health. And instead of being in fear, we are in choice. Now, another really powerful practice that I learned from the Plum Village community is the practice of seed watering. So we all have helpful and unhelpful seeds of emotion inside of us. And depending on what seeds we choose to water, certain seeds grow more than others. I mean, this whole concept of seed watering is so profound. I think even in our relationships, if you've been married for a long time, sometimes you may have the thought, well, the grass might be greener on the other side. But the truth is, the grass is only greener when you water it, right? So this practice of seed watering is so essential, watering seeds in ourselves and watering seeds in others. Now, mindfulness helps us build awareness about what seeds we're watering. For example, when I was in the classroom and I'd tell my students that I cared about them and then I acted in caring ways, I was watering helpful seeds inside of them and inside of myself. Now, when I don't work with challenging emotions and I react, then I'm watering unhelpful seeds. The more I water certain seeds, the stronger they grow. And my husband and I have committed to a practice of selective watering in which we try our best, and it's not always easy, but we try our best to water only the helpful seeds in each other. And I've learned that the most important practice of all is watering helpful seeds in myself. Now, when I initially began teaching my students about seed watering, like 15 years ago, I used the terms good and bad. But thankfully, soon after I began, John and Mila Kabat-Zinn visited my school and looked through my lesson plans, and in their feedback, Mila in particular shared the importance of using the language of helpful and unhelpful seeds instead. Good and bad implies judgment. And while mindfulness isn't about judging, it does call for discernment, right? We recognize when we've been unskillful, but instead of berating ourselves, we look deeply into the causes of our unskillfulness so we can behave in a more thoughtful way in the future. Now, there is a gentle and kind quality to this inquiry we engage in through the practice of mindfulness. Seed watering reminds me of the two wolves story, which some of you may be familiar with, where a Cherokee elder tells his grandson that there is a battle between two wolves inside us all. One wolf is hatred, greed, anger, and jealousy, and the other wolf is kindness, peace, love, and generosity. And when the elder's grandson asks, "Who wins?" his grandfather replies, "Whichever one you feed." Now, inside of us, we have these helpful and unhelpful seeds of emotion. And so, this practice of becoming aware of what seeds we're watering is a way we can really access our true power. Now, I love this quote from David Hawkins about power, that the only way to enhance one's power in the world is by increasing one's integrity, understanding, and capacity for compassion. And boy, is that even more true in this moment of COVID-19, right? Now, the nature of true power is often confused with force. True power resides from within, and a good example is Gandhi's struggle for Indian independence. And the British tried to apply force, but they were met with the resistance of true power. And when they were met with this particular true power, then ultimately their regime collapsed. Now, a proposition that Dr. Hawkins presents in his book, Power versus Force, is that the subconscious is very well attuned to whether something has a negative or positive effect for our body. And one of the most profound aspects of this book can be found in this map of consciousness, which is a scalable chart based on different levels of consciousness, ranging from 0, which is shame, all the way up to 1,000, which is enlightenment. Now, all levels below 200 are destructive of life, both at the individual and societal level. And in contrast, all levels above 200 are constructive expressions of power. Now, the decisive level, 200, is the fulcrum that divides the general areas of force or the falsehood from power or truth. And 200 is actually courage. I think it's really interesting that anger is not the worst emotion that you can feel, but rather it's shame and guilt that have a far more negative impact on us. Now, my own leadership of studying this map of human consciousness, I try to make decisions every day to come from this level of higher consciousness as opposed to lower consciousness. And I want to offer a way of looking at this scale. So in every moment, we have a choice to choose love or fear. Marianne Williamson and many others talk about this. And a powerful practice of mine is to bring the question, what would love do now to each moment? And a great way to ensure the practice is not just mental is we can check in on our posture and our internal life and try to expand rather than contract. So literally breathing in and raising our arms up in the air a few times, aligning with that sense of expansion. Now, the next mindfulness-based self-care strategy I'd like to lift up is just that of mindful self-compassion. And you may be familiar with the work of Kristen Neff and Chris Kermer, but right now, we got to be kind to ourselves. We got to practice self-compassion. And one of the easiest ways to do that is to just acknowledge that this is a hard moment and to orient ourselves towards what would a friend say to ourselves. And so I really like to think about self-compassion as bringing a quality of befriending myself in each moment, really being a friend to myself. And through doing that too, we also acknowledge our common humanity, that it is part of being human to experience challenges and difficulty and pain and suffering. So just gently and kindly saying to ourselves, this is a hard moment. And then what would a friend say to oneself? Now, I also want to share this resource. Some of you that may be in roles where you are supporting educators, there's this resource that you can instantly freely get at my website called Integrating Mindfulness into Virtual Professional Learning Spaces. And it really focuses on integrating mindfulness both into virtual meeting or professional learning and on facilitating a virtual mindful practice group. I've included agenda templates to really make your planning easy. So if that resource is of interest to you, definitely check it out. And I'd love for us to just pause now and to think back. So at the start of this whole session around what is mindfulness, I had you tune inwards and reflect on what mindfulness was for you and how you define it. So I invite you now to just reflect on any possible new learnings. And I am an educator, and us educators, we love sentence stems, right? So I used to think mindfulness was, now I think mindfulness is, are there any new learnings that might be coming to mind? So if you like, you can jot that down or make a mental note. And now we're going to move on to social and emotional learning. Now, oftentimes SEL and mindfulness are used interchangeably, but they are completely different fields. And while there are complements and overlaps, I want to really offer you some clarity around what SEL is. You know, it's a term that's used widely, but often without defining it. So let's take a moment to lift up prior knowledge like we did in our mindfulness component and just reflect on these prompts around, you know, what is SEL for you? And in 2017, in an analysis conducted by Education First, one of the things that they lifted up was the importance of creating coherence across SEL frameworks and terminologies. I mean, this was named as a top priority. And the National Commission on Social, Emotional, and Academic Development at the Aspen Institute, which is now sunsetted, it really filled a gap by bringing together policymakers, practitioners, and researchers from across the field. And in May of 2018, they offered the following comprehensive definition of social and emotional learning, or as they like to refer to it, social and emotional academic development. Now, social and emotional development comprises specific skills and competencies that people need in order to set goals, manage behavior, build relationships, and process and remember information. These skills and competencies develop in a complex system of contexts, interactions, and relationships, suggesting that organizations must take a comprehensive approach to promoting social and emotional development, addressing adult skills and beliefs. I'm going to say that again, addressing adult skills and beliefs, and that such approaches are the most effective when designed to match the needs and context of specific organizations and communities. Put simply, social and emotional development is not just about the skills that students and adults possess and deploy, it's also about the features of the educational setting itself, including culture and climate. Now, I love this comprehensive definition because it takes into account the importance of context when engaging in SEL, and it really positions SEL as more than just a set of skills and competencies developed irrespective of culture and community, or as something only for young people. You know, one of the most important aspects of this definition is the emphasis on addressing adult skills and beliefs. Now, central to the success of SEL is an examination of adult beliefs, because SEL isn't about fixing students, but about seeing the whole picture of who we are, especially our strengths and assets. When I was in Oakland, we actually developed SEL standards, but unlike most other districts, our standards weren't just designated to students, but they were pre-K to adult, because we really felt that teachers can't transmit and teach what they don't also cultivate. Early on in my career, a former district leader seemed to contend that teachers either have SEL skills or they don't, and he seemed to believe that these skills were innate. But from my experience working with students, adults, and my own personal SEL journey, I often say that my SEL skills only got better when I got married, and wow, parenting has brought them to a whole other level. But I know that these skills can be taught and learned. Now, in Oakland, we expanded the Castle definition of social and emotional learning to also include an equity lens, which states, through strengthening our SEL competencies, we are better able to connect across race, class, gender, identity, sexual orientation, learning needs, and age. Educational equity means that every student receives what they need in order to develop their full academic, social, and emotional potential, despite race, gender, ethnicity, language, disability, family background, or family income. Now, in addition to allocating resources equitably, we also must have an understanding of critical race theory and interrupt practices that are inequitable so we can create more inclusive school environments. Now, it's really important for educators to recognize the legacy of racism in our schools if we're really going to support our students' SEL. And in an August 2018 EdWeek commentary, LaShawn Chapman and Kathleen Osta remind us that our context in the United States has always been racialized, and our race impacts our access to opportunities and how we experience the world. They wrote, "From the beginning, schools in the United States were designed to benefit and affirm the values and culture of white people in power. Over time, this white dominant culture shaped the educational structures and policies that articulate how children are expected to behave, communicate, and interact. Today, how learning is organized and evaluated is still rooted in an acceptance of whiteness as natural and normal. The presumption that students from a culture outside this norm come to school with deficits in their intelligence, families, culture, or communities is built into the DNA of public education." Now, for many years, SEL was thought to be race and culture agnostic, but those of us who are not part of the dominant culture know that SEL cannot be race, culture, or identity agnostic. It has to be identity affirming. And over the years, our SEL team in Oakland really began holding a racial equity lens more closely to the work. And we saw that in schools with a majority of students of color, SEL was often being identified as a self-management skill to address classroom behavior problems. But in our Hill schools, SEL was being viewed as delivering 21st century skills for success. Now, as a result, our team made a presentation at a Castle Collaborating Districts gathering around how SEL and mindfulness are often taken up as behavior management tools in schools with predominantly Black and Brown children. And this professional learning sparked a growing conversation within Castle around SEL and equity. Castle convened an equity working group to examine how transformative SEL can really be an avenue for greater educational equity. Now, transformative SEL encourages us to be mindful of when SEL is reduced solely to an intervention to address the perceived deficits of students of color living in poverty while ignoring the impact of inequities in our system, and really utilize SEL instead as a force for developing student agency to lead to positive change in their own communities. Now, transformative SEL is informed by interconnectedness and awareness of structural inequities, while also including practices that are culturally responsive, incorporate student voice, and promote social justice. Currently, Castle is refining these equity elaborations to their framework and exploring how SEL can truly be culturally responsive and deepen our understanding of racial stress, systemic oppression, and implicit bias. Now I'm going to share one of the equity elaborations now so you get a better sense of what I mean by equity elaborations. And so here we have the self-awareness core competency, and this is from the Castle framework around SEL. And what it lifts up in the core Castle competencies is that self-awareness refers to labeling one's feelings, relating feelings, thoughts to behavior, accurate self-assessment of strengths and challenges, self-efficacy, and optimism. And then here with the equity elaborations, we see the importance of examining various social identities, recognizing one's biases and deriving constructive meaning of social identities, and grounding in and affirming of cultural heritage. So if you'd like to go deeper, I have an online course that opens this April 23rd, and we go a lot deeper into the equity elaborations of social and emotional learning, but this is just a little preview so you get a better sense of what I'm talking about. And in an effort to really support implementation of SEL, my colleague James Gallagher and I came up with this building your SEL house analogy as a roadmap for how we can think about implementation. And this was really inspired by the different chapters in my book, SEL Every Day. And each step is gone over in detail in my SEL Everyday online course. And I want to preview this roadmap here for you. And the first step is the blueprint and foundation. And we're going to spend a little bit of time on the blueprint and foundation today. But the others are constructing the framing and wiring your classroom, which focuses on integrating SEL with academic learning, which really happens through what students learn, the curriculum, and how they learn it, the process. And this is where we utilize teaching practices that infuse and reinforce SEL while also providing opportunities to teach SEL skills explicitly, like academic discussion or cooperative learning. And then the third step, install the drywall and furnishings, enacting SEL in your classroom and school, is all about lesson planning with SEL in mind. And if you go to my website, you can actually get an SEL integrated lesson plan template right away that walks you through how to do this. And then the fourth step, maintaining and renovating continuous improvement, really focuses on reflective practice and the question of how do I know if this is making a difference? So let's talk a little bit about the first step. And I want to focus in on how creating community and conditions for learning starts with you. So there are a few brilliant souls to whom I often turn to for guidance, and I try to summon and connect with them through their writing. And one of these people is the great late Dr. Maya Angelou, and her heartful wisdom and understanding of human relationships never ceases to amaze and move me. And Dr. Angelou felt that there were 4 questions we unconsciously ask each other all the time. Do you see me? Do you care that I am here? Am I enough for you, or do you need me to be better in some way? And can I tell that I'm special by the way you look at me? Now, in order to answer these 4 questions for our students, for our families, we have to be fully present and available. And as teachers, and really as humans, right, the greatest gift we can offer is our presence. Now, when I first read this quote, it stopped me in my tracks. And as I read it to you now, I'm going to model the contemplative practice, Lectio Divina, Latin for divine reading, which is a traditional practice of scriptural reading, meditation, and prayer that's really intended to promote this communion with the divine. When we read powerful quotes or poems with a deeper attention and intention in this way, it enables us to let the words fall into our being and heart. And the practice of Lectio Divina is really to just understand that the text is a gift to be received. So let the text come to you. I'm going to read it slowly. And this is a way of prayer, and I ask for you to interpret that in however it feels comfortable for you. So just take a moment and close your eyes and listen to my voice. I've come to the frightening conclusion that I am the decisive element in the classroom. It is my personal approach that creates the climate. It is my daily mood that makes the weather. As a teacher, I possess a tremendous power to make a child's life miserable or joyous. I can be a tool of torture or an instrument of inspiration. I can humiliate or heal. In all situations, it is my response that decides whether a crisis will be escalated or de-escalated, and a child humanized or dehumanized. Now, I love this quote because it really communicates how the unwritten curriculum is your presence, which is something my former teaching colleague Adele would say, and the latest research also backs it up. This article here by Stephanie Jones and some of her colleagues, and Stephanie is one of the leading SEL researchers, and The article in this article is kind of my go-to professional learning article when I lead adult SEL related professional learning. And it really lifts up how critical adult SEL is to the teaching of SEL. And one of the most powerful ways we can cultivate our own adult SEL is through establishing a mindfulness practice. And this article I wrote here for Mindful Schools talks more about how SEL and mindfulness can work together. So now, after this kind of brief dive into SEL, I invite you to engage with these sentence stems. Perhaps there may have been some new learnings, and you can either jot down your answers. I used to think SEL was, now I think SEL is, or just make a mental note. And we're going to move on to the portion of this offering that's really focused on belonging. And for me, mindfulness and SEL are ultimately in service of belonging. So this is my son. Again, I showed a picture of him in my mindfulness definition slide, and he's multiracial. His grandparents were born in Kenya, India, and Japan. And what I want for him more than anything is to feel a sense of belonging. So let's just engage in a little contemplation and spend some time reflecting on belonging together. So if it feels safe, I invite you to close your eyes and just connect with a time when you've really felt part of a community, when you felt included, and when you felt a sense of belonging. And as that moment in time replays through your mind's eye, pay attention to how you're feeling. What are some of the emotions that come up for you? What are some of the words that come up for you when you think about and reflect on this time when you've really felt a sense of belonging? And I'd like for you to just pay attention to how you feel in your body. If you're in a space where you can speak aloud, you can say the words aloud that come to you when you think of this experience of belonging. And if you can't say the words aloud, just say them silently to yourself and tune into how those words affect your body and being. And now I invite you to bring to mind a time when you didn't feel a sense of belonging, when you felt excluded or othered. What did it feel like? Replay that experience in your mind's eye. And as you do that, tune in to what's coming up for you in your body and in your being. If you're in a place where you can speak aloud, say the words that are coming to mind as you replay this experience. And just touch into how those words land in your body and being. If you can't say them aloud, you can say them silently to yourself. And then think back to that consciousness scale from David Hawkins. And think about your experience of belonging and where those feeling states may have showed up on that consciousness scale. And then think about your experience when you felt excluded or othered and where those feeling states came up in that consciousness scale. We do this work so no one is othered. For me, that is really the core of why we do this work. It's really so no one is othered. So what is belonging? Like mindfulness, like SEL, it's a term that's often thrown around. And this definition is really the one that resonates with me the most. And I'll just read it aloud. And as I read it aloud, just see if there are any words or phrases that resonate with you. So belonging is a state of enacting and being wholeness. It requires an expansive quality, the ability to zoom out and expand our circles of concern and care. Within the process of creating belonging is the need to eliminate or reduce the negative effects of harmful and oppressive structures. Equity-based strategies and decolonizing efforts are intrinsic to the work of belonging. Prioritizing the right to belong is vital in order to have a thriving and politically engaged populace, which informs distributive and restorative decision-making. And that's from Sonali Sangeeta Balaji. Now, belonging is not simply joining something, right? Belonging is about co-creating the thing that you're joining, and in order to co-create, you need power. Co-creating is a very different process, and inclusion, frankly, isn't enough anymore. Now, belonging not only affects how we perceive things, but it affects who we are. And in the educational context, research has shown that belonging in schools has a direct impact on academic performance. Belonging defines who benefits from caring relationships and who has access to rigorous content and engaging instruction. Now, to really understand belonging, we need to unpack othering. And what I'm about to share with you is really inspired by the work of John A. Powell and the Haas Institute for a Fair and Inclusive Society at UC Berkeley. So othering happens at different levels. It can happen between two people, and that can cause a lot of harm, but it can also happen institutionally. So a very basic example is if you're in a building and there are only bathrooms for males and females, then you are structurally othering folks who don't identify exclusively as male or female. Essentially, you're saying you don't belong here. Now, there are different ways in which we other, and othering is a problem wherever it happens, but it's not the same. There's a power dynamic to othering that we have to pay attention to. Now, belonging, or being fully human, means more than having access. Belonging entails being respected at a basic level that includes the right to both co-create and make demands upon society. So there's a term you may have heard called VUCA. And VUCA stands for, we often talk about how we're living in VUCA times, and VUCA stands for volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. Now, John Powell offers a high-level snapshot and analysis of two paths that we can take during these VUCA times. We can either bridge or break. Now, bridging is hard work, but SEL and mindfulness are the how of bridge building. And there are long and short bridges. And sometimes we first have to bridge within ourselves because we may be broken inside. Now, I encourage you to really look up John Powell's work and to visit the Haas Institute for a Fair and Inclusive Society website. And there's a great conference that's held yearly, the Othering and Belonging Conference in Oakland, that I encourage you to learn more about. But I think just even this very simple way of thinking about how we can either bridge or break, and how SEL and mindfulness are the how of bridging, is very powerful. And there are two offerings that I want to lift up to help cultivate belonging in classrooms and schools. And the first are 3 promising approaches for creating belonging. And I go deeper into these in my SEL Everyday online course. And the 3 are cultural integration, community building, and ethnic racial identity development. And the second offering is a powerful strategy for the classroom that really focuses in on classroom community building component of these 3 promising approaches. And that strategy is the 3 signature SEL practices. Now, the 3 signature SEL practices were developed by my mentor and colleague, Castle Professional Development Consultant Ann McKay Bryson. And they're used widely among classroom teachers to build and sustain community while also promoting academic engagement. And the organization Engaging Schools defines academic engagement as sustained learning that involves students emotionally, cognitively and behaviorally. Now, these practices are also foundational professional learning and meetings. And so we also go deeper into these 3 practices of welcoming routines and rituals, or welcoming inclusion activities for inclusion, engaging pedagogy, which focuses on academic integration, transitions and brain breaks, and optimistic closures, reflections, and looking forward. And we go deeper into these in my course as well. One of my favorite optimistic closures is called an appreciation apology, or AHA, and it was one of Edutopia's 60-second classroom strategies. So if you haven't seen that video yet, check it out. Just Google appreciation apology AHA Edutopia, and its teacher Akeem Ballard, who I believe is at one of the Summit schools in Northern California. And it's a great video, and it's a beautiful example of an optimistic closure. Now, when used consistently and from a place where the educator has done their deep inner work, and really built their own adult SEL, the 3 SEL practices can create conditions for growth and learning across all of the 5 core CASEL competencies of self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, responsible decision-making, and relationship skills. And they can also, at the same time, really support culturally responsive teaching strategies that highlight relationality and student voice that can create and sustain collaborative classrooms. Now, the 2 key components when designing any of these 3 signature SEL practices are individual time for thinking and intentional social interaction. So again, the 2 components of a welcoming inclusion activity, an engaging pedagogy or engaging strategy, and optimistic closure are individual time for thinking and intentional social interaction. So I encourage you to check out that video I mentioned, and to see, you probably already are incorporating a lot of the 3 signature SEL practices, but what are some ways you could even go deeper in incorporating these strategies in your practice? And then I also want to just lift up that in our current moment of teaching virtually, one of the things we can do, and this is actually from the resource I mentioned earlier that I wrote around integrating mindfulness into virtual professional learning spaces, but I would invite you to really just write down and almost create a chart like this, what it is in person that you might be doing. So you might be utilizing a talking piece, right? If you were utilizing maybe one of these engaging strategies and one of them involved utilizing a talking piece, and you would reflect on why it's important. It supports equity of voice, and then brainstorm what could it look like virtually. So inviting participants who speak to call on the next person verbally and virtually, passing the talking piece. And everyone can bring their own talking piece, and before speaking for the first time, they can share what their talking piece is and why they brought it. And everyone holds their talking piece up to the screen when they speak. So again, I encourage you to think deeply about these 3 signature SEL practices, and then use a chart like this to really translate them into a virtual setting. Now, the way I make sense of this work is that mindfulness in SEL must be rooted in interbeing and centered in belonging. And I want to leave you with my sense-making visual for how I understand this work. And I'm reminded by this quote from Cornel West that justice is what love looks like in public, just like tenderness is what love feels like in private. And also this quote from Miss Lila Watson, if you have come here to help me, you're wasting your time. But if you have come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together. Liberation is a powerful concept in my ancestral and spiritual tradition, and I'm not just referring to freedom in a relative sense, which is very, very important, but also in an ultimate sense, which for me is freedom from this false belief that I am somehow separate from you and from all life. You know, that night in Delhi that I spoke about earlier on the anniversary of Gandhi's birth, at the site of his death, where Thich Nhat Hanh introduced this term interbeing to me, he also led us through an exercise where we looked deeply into our hands to see our ancestors and our descendants. And that night I touched my great-great-grandfather in me, and he was a freedom fighter in the early Indian independence movement. He died at the hands of the colonizers, and I felt how his struggle continues to live on in me and in the many forms colonization takes today. My father is actually a bridge engineer, and that night in Delhi, on the anniversary of Gandhi's birth, at the site of his death, I made a commitment to being another kind of bridge builder, one that's dedicated to creating a more compassionate and just world rooted in interbeing. We are living the legacy of our ancestors, those who chose to bridge, those who chose to break, and those who often had no choice, like my great-great-grandfather and his fellow freedom fighters pictured here. You know, as a mother, my understanding of how I continue on and what I pass on is best expressed in holding this provocation from Larry Ward, who I mentioned earlier, and holding this provocation, what kind of ancestor am I willing to be, front and center? One of Larry's practices involves carrying photographs that are important to him. And one of the photographs he carries with him everywhere is a photograph of our beloved early ancestor, Lucy. And he carries around this photograph of Lucy to remind us that we are evolutionary beings. And as Larry says, you know, many of us think that we are at the summit of this evolutionary process instead of understanding we may just be a stop along the way, which will end if we don't get our act together. So take care of yourself first, but then ask yourself, what kind of ancestor do I want to be? Now, I've learned that to make something come alive, we have to breathe it in. So let us breathe together as we hold this question in our hearts. What kind of ancestor am I willing to be? You know, the motto of the state of Rhode Island, where my husband grew up, is hope as an anchor for the soul. That cross within the anchor is a symbol of masculinity, while the crescent moon within the symbol is feminine, representing the womb. It is symbolic of hope in how, when lifted up from the water of a port, it represents a new adventure, a new voyage. So as we move into this great unknown of COVID-19's unfolding, perhaps we can think of it as Joanna Macy described, the great turning, the essential adventure of our time. My fellow South Asian sister Valerie Kaur says, what if this darkness is not the darkness of the tomb, but the darkness of the womb? And the Indian author Arundhati Roy says, another world is not only possible, she is on her way. I can hear her breathing. My invitation for all of us is to reflect on and engage in the active hope I mentioned before as an anchor, much like our breath can be an anchor in our mindfulness practice. I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for spending this time with me. And if you'd like to go deeper with what I've shared, this is just a tiny taste of this online program that I've put together. And while I began developing these courses before COVID-19 began to unfold, now more than ever, it's become clear how vital virtual learning opportunities that lift our hearts, honor our spirits, and inspire greater purpose are. And I developed the SEL Everyday Online courses because I was called to create a nourishing online program for cultivating mindfulness and SEL in service of belonging, really to meet a huge need and fill a gap in the world of professional development offerings for educators and educational leaders. Through these courses, I am offering all of my learnings countless resources, and most importantly, a roadmap for ensuring mindfulness and SEL and service of belonging is part of your personal and professional life. And this is what the world needs now. There are 2 paths you can take depending on your context. SEL Every Day for the Educator will equip you with everything you need to know to begin creating a relationship-centered classroom, utilize instructional practices to promote SEL across academic content, make SEL explicit in lesson planning, and integrate mindfulness and anti-racist practices into your classroom and life. And this course is more than 8.5 hours of content. Just that's the video lessons alone. And it's everything I wish I knew when I was in the classroom. And it's a 4-module self-paced online course. Now, SEL Every Day for the Leader will prepare you to really begin leading an equity-informed SEL initiative in your context that integrates mindfulness and shifts classroom and school-wide practices. You'll deepen your expertise and boost your confidence as an SEL professional developer, coach, consultant, or leader of SEL in your school, district, or organization. And this course is more than 12 hours of just video content, the video lessons. There's so much more than that included in the course. And it's everything I wish I knew before I got my district level SEL job. And it's a 6-module self-paced online course. The courses come with lifetime access, and they open April 23rd. And in response to these unprecedented times of uncertainty and upheaval, I'm offering a significant discount on my already heavily discounted courses for the first 15 days through May 8th. So I'm offering $250 off of the Leader course and $150 off the Educator course. And if you'd like to learn more, just go to my website, MeenaSrinivasan.com. Now, these courses contain everything I wish I knew when I was either a classroom teacher or before I became a district SEL leader. But most importantly, my hope is that these courses support your SEL journey and enable you to have more impact while also activating your active hope. I wish you well. Take care of yourself so you can care for others. And I'd like to close with inviting you to just gently close your eyes and tune inwards and place your hand on your heart. And let's take 3 collective breaths together. With the first breath, I'd like you to honor yourself for taking the time and investing your energy in creating a more compassionate and just world by just being here and watching this webinar. And with the second breath, I'd like for us to honor everyone who is on this path with us. And even though you might be here on your own, you are connected to so many other educators who care deeply about young people and see education as the vehicle for societal transformation and ultimately our collective liberation. And with the last breath, I invite you to think about the next generation and the young people out there. If you have children, I invite you to think about them with this last breath. And let us really commit to being the kind of ancestor we need to be to ensure we are leaving a more just and compassionate world. Thank you so much. Take care. I wish you well.